I'm going to start with you, Lebogang, because you're right here. So the figures are down, but we have heard that we do need to try and target the youth more effectively, reduce the stigma, increase education. How do we go about doing that?
I think, thank you for having me in studio. I think one of the ways we need to start penetrating the youth is go to where the youth are at. You know, for simple example, it's a Saturday today, young people are going out, they're going to parties, events, but you rarely find a condom dispenser or whatever the case is. Another thing we need to do is make sure that we start implementing the policy that was signed in 2014 by our Ministers of Health and Education on comprehensive sexuality education and on access to adolescent health-friendly youth services. You know, we need to start implementing those things, implement CSE in schools. Kids must start getting comprehensive sexuality education. We need to start having the conversation more often. You know, we need to speak young people's language. We've got a lot of campaigns. We've got the biggest campaigns in Africa that we have, but I guess it's speaking their language, communicating differently, and going down to their level.
Barbara, I want to pull you in here and double check with you. We're talking about adolescents here. Do we need to also be talking about younger and younger children? Is that becoming something that we need to consider in terms of changing our focus or our strategy?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question? It's a little bit difficult to hear you.
No problem, Barbara. I was asking whether you think we need to start addressing education about sex and HIV/AIDS to younger children and not just adolescents.
I think it's extremely important that children and adolescents are educated on HIV and AIDS. There is so much ignorance, and children don't understand, and adolescents don't understand. And I think there's a very dire need for an explanation of ARVs and HIV and how they work and how HIV and AIDS can be prevented.
And apart from that, how do we discuss with children and with adolescents their rights as far as disclosing their status is concerned?
You know, I always maintain that HIV is not what is killing us. We have treatment for that. We have ARVs. It is stigma that is the real disease, and that is so much harder to treat. I think a lot of the time people give HIV so much power in their lives when we need to understand that HIV is really not that powerful. We have ARVs. We are so much more powerful than the virus. If people understood the way that ARVs work, and it is not this monster disease, left untreated, HIV is deadly, but it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. And as I said, it's stigma that's killing us, not the virus.
So when we talk about stigma, there's obviously also a double-pronged approach where we're looking at stigma in terms of getting treatment once you are infected, but also the stigma related to preventing infection. So if discussions aren't happening openly. So I want to ask you, Lebogang, what do you think, and you were talking about policy earlier, what do you think needs to change in terms of policy when it comes to stigma and preventing new infections?
I think just before I even touch on policy, I think we need to forget that HIV is also a very social issue than it is a medical issue, and we've got other social issues, your gender-based violence, your poverty, that we also should be addressing, your lack of unemployment that leads to the blesser and blessee and whatever the case is, right? But coming back to stigma, unfortunately the only way we can fight stigma is changing the face of HIV. Whatever that was introduced to us back in the 80s when the virus came out, that is what we're still struggling with. You know, we're struggling with the fact that parents aren't speaking to young people, because as much as we can do the education, the campaigns, it needs to start from the home. You know, it's difficult to change a perception of a parent, but it's always possible to influence change. When it comes to policies, we need to make sure that comprehensive sexuality education is implemented in schools in South Africa, and that is through life orientation. Take that subject as a serious subject and not a subject where kids just chill and talk about whatever. That is where kids, and let us not stop only from primary, high school. Let it be a subject we have all throughout varsity, because we don't stop having sexual activity. And I also think it's conversations around the virus. We talk about the virus when there's World AIDS Day. We talk about the virus at certain times, and I think this is when the media must also work with us as activists and people in this space to continue having the conversation. We don't have condom ads. HIV prevention methods, we don't have much. We've got PrEP, right, that was announced 2 years back, but it's not accessible publicly as much. It's accessible in some places. We need to still fight accessibility of that. We need to fight for more prevention methods. We know that right now we're using treatment as prevention, making sure that people are on treatment and that they adhere on treatment and that they are virally suppressed. That speaks to the 1990 goals that have been set by a World Organization, Health and UNAIDS.
Barbara, it says a lot to me that both of our guests here today are women, and we know that young girls and young women are by far more affected by HIV and AIDS.
Yes.
How would you go about addressing that to ensure that we protect young girls and women from contracting the disease in the first place?
I do. Sorry, it's a very bad it's a very bad line here. I definitely believe what you were discussing now, that HIV education should be mandatory in schools so that children can learn from a young age exactly the implications and how it works and how HIV, etc. works. I think women also need to, well, not just women, but I think all of us, is to take responsibility for ourselves in terms of using condoms, making sure that we're protected. You know, I've heard so many stories of people that have been infected through their boyfriends, or people that have been infected through their husbands, or, you know, people lie. And I think it's really important for us to, if we each took responsibility for ourselves, you know, we could significantly reduce the risk of infection.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Coming back to that notion that it's a social disease.
It's a social disease, and I think it's also, remember, it's also the gender norms, patriarchal norms within the relationship, the power the man has, and we know the stories, we know the conversations, you know. I think it's just as women taking, like Barbara said, taking responsibility of your own sexual reproductive health rights, and knowing that you have a right to protect yourself. If the person doesn't want to use a condom, you don't need to engage in that sexual activity. Of course, there are circumstances that enforces one too, right? But knowing that you can access post-exposure prophylaxis from your pharmacies, from your doctor, knowing that there are other measures, and just also having the conversation with your sexual partner. You know, we don't have the conversation as young people when you meet someone to say, hey, what's your HIV status? That is something, as much as you want to know how much someone earns, where someone lives, that should be part of the question, to say, what is your HIV status? Because we know that the numbers are increasing daily, and until we find everyone who is positive and put them on treatment, we have to have such conversations. It's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's just looking after yourself and making sure that you don't find yourself infected, of course, because it is really another burden to live with the virus, like I'm living with the virus and everyone else living with the virus, you know. But it's just really being in control of your own sexual reproductive health rights, and just being in control of the fact that I can carry a condom as a woman. Yes, we've got female condoms,
Yes.
even though they're not as accessible. We've got the male condom, and it doesn't mean only males must buy them and introduce them in a sexual activity, you know. It's just having those conversations.
So taking the conversation out of the space of solely activism and bringing it into everyday life.
It
and
should be
empowering
everyday life, because it can, I think as young people, like I did myself, I thought I was superior to the virus because of the background I had, where I grew up, the school I went to. And I think for some reason there's still ignorance around young people thinking, nah, I'll probably fall pregnant, I won't catch the virus, you know. That's the same mentality I had, but it's just knowing that you can catch the virus as long as you are involving yourself in risky sexual behavior, as long as you don't know your partner's status, as long as you're not having that conversation. It has to come from within. We can do all the campaigns, we can speak about it, but at the end of the day, it's an individual's decision to make, and it's for your own future, really.
Thank you very much, ladies, both for your time. We'll
you for having
keep an
us.
eye on those figures coming out as the conversation around HIV and AIDS and those
Definitely.
statistics come out.